Hello, Blogging Heads Nation. I'm Daniel Drezner. I'm a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. I also write spoiler alerts for the Washington Post. And I am not here with my normal sparring partner, Heather Hurlburt, but rather we have a special edition of Blogging Heads. I'm here talking to Daniel Bessner. Dan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi, my name is Daniel Bessner. I'm the Pyle Assistant Professor in American Foreign Policy at the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington.
Wait, you have a name before you, like even as an assistant professor?
I do, yes.
God damn it. I mean, I swear to God, Fletcher is screwing me over. I'm just a professor.
I got lucky. I'm hashtag blessed. What can I say?
Nicely done. Anyway, we are here to talk about a few things, I think, one of which is a book, which I believe I have right here. Yes, Democracy in Exile. Hans Speer and the Rise of the Defense Intellectual, which God knows I am interested in, is I am the author of this book, which is very interested in the role of foreign policy intellectuals. As well, Dan, do you prefer Dan or Daniel? I'm sorry.
Daniel's fine.
Okay. Daniel is also the author of one of what I would describe as a raft of recent interventions in progressive foreign policy circles on essentially what should American foreign policy look like in a post-Trump age, which was published on the op-ed page of the New York Times.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, so happy to start this conversation. By the way, I actually, let me start by asking, so you published that op-ed. Were you aware that there were these, is it my imagination or is there suddenly like a geyser of these things coming out?
Yeah, there's been a bunch. I was aware. There's a piece by Dan Nexon, Stephen Wertheim, a colleague and friend of mine, has written several of these pieces as well. I think Sarah Jones in the New Republic did a piece, and I think especially I want to call out Aziz Rana for N+1 in Boston Review, has written a number of excellent pieces on progressive foreign policy as well, and sort of the decline of the Cold War order. And what I essentially tried to do, a lot of those pieces are excellent, but they focus specifically on policy problems in particular areas of intervention or non-intervention, as the case is more likely to be. And what I wanted to do is think about the principles that should or shouldn't, if you disagree, undergird a progressive foreign policy going forward. Basically, because I think, as you pointed out in your own work, a lot of this stuff, and as your own work is symptomatic of, and both drawing too, a lot of these ideological institutions, these intellectual institutions have come under extreme criticism in the last few years. And Trump was really, I think, the apotheosis and the apex of this progressive delegitimization of these institutions pretty much since Afghanistan and Iraq on one hand and the financial crisis in the other. And so it's not surprising that once Trump came to power that a bunch of people are looking for a path forward as these traditional institutions are delegitimized and people working for them really don't know what they're doing.
That's true. And I think other people I would add who've written, Peter Beinart had something in The Atlantic, I think.
Yeah, I have a fair number of criticisms about Beinart's.
Okay. And then also, Bernie, for lack of a way of putting it, Bernie Sanders has a couple of things that's come out, which I assume is the work of Matt Duss, who is one of his sort of foreign policy guru. Yeah,
not only foreign policy guru, but a alumnus of the University of Washington's Jackson School.
I applaud your plug there. That is excellent. Okay. So which do you want to start with first? Do you want to start with the book or do you want to start with the progressive foreign policy debate?
Whatever you want to do, whatever you're most interested in. Probably the progressive foreign policy.
I'm definitely interested in the progressive foreign policy debate. Why don't we start there? Because let me ask you something. So I haven't read everything that you listed, but I've read a fair amount of it. And it does strike me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there does seem to be a sort of deep schism that runs between these two. First, on the one hand, this is all to the good, because you can argue that frankly, progressives haven't had a foreign policy debate in quite some time. I think you can argue 9/11 sort of caused a general shift to the right in terms of even Democratic Party foreign policy circles. I think Hillary Clinton being the nominee in 2016 probably didn't help. And I think one of the things that hurt Bernie Sanders, frankly, was that in contrast to now, he really didn't have much to say on foreign policy when he was running in 2016. And you're right, I think that to some extent, Trump is almost like the anti-sorbet in the sense that, it's requiring everyone to say, okay, clearly the world we're going to inherit after him is going to look somewhat different. can you just pursue a restorationist foreign policy, or are there going to be other things to do? And this gives an opportunity for everyone to, bring up the slings and arrows of outrageous misfortune that the previous foreign policy was necessarily responsible for. And so I do think there's some interesting ideas out there on the progressive side. That said, it does strike me, and I want, correct me if I'm wrong, the schism does seem to be between, I would say, folks like you and Weinert, where your foreign policy, your reaction to what's happening is, in some ways, a more Jeffersonian tack, which is to say, a more circumscribed foreign policy, a limiting of foreign policy ambition, in no small part because foreign policy ambitions have not worked out terribly well in terms of U.S. foreign policy for the last 20 years, and therefore maybe we should actually, demonstrate a greater degree of risk aversion. Whereas, folks like, let's say, Nixon or Sanders, interestingly, I think are actually adopting what I would describe as sort of a progressive value-based foreign policy, which is to say that the same values that should animate progressivism at home should also animate the way we approach the rest of the world. And as a result, this leads to some relatively interesting, there's a way in which you can interpret Bernie Sanders' foreign policy musings as really ambitious in some ways, as this sort of anti-kleptocratic, coalition where the forces of, kleptocracy and authoritarianism elsewhere really do threaten the United States, and therefore, and us doing nothing in response to that will actually hurt American interests. Therefore, we need to push back aggressively.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. I would just add that I really think it goes much deeper than the 1990s. I don't think we've had a real progressive foreign policy debate since 1946. I
was being nice, but okay.
Seriously, I think it's important to recognize that a bipartisan consensus has undergirded the rise and expansion of both the national security state on one hand and what I would term the American empire on the other hand. So I think what I would term the short American century, 1945 to 2016, is really coming to an end. And we're really starting to think of a foreign policy beyond this consensus. America needs to be the hegemon. America needs to govern the world. And what we had after 89 to 91 was what I call the Cold War on steroids, where you had a lot of the assumptions and logics of the Cold War governing U.S. foreign policy in the 1990s. Really, after the 9/11 attacks, this sort of incredibly global vision of what the United States can do, the idea that the U.S. power can do what it wants in the world. So I would say we're really rethinking for the first time in decades what a progressive foreign policy should be. And I just want to say that it's not only progressives' fault that we haven't had a discussion, but they were systematically, basically locked out of the emergent national security state starting in the late 1940s, where if you're someone who questioned the idea that America should lead the quote-unquote of Western civilization in the battle against communism, you essentially weren't invited into places like the State Department or parastate institutions like RAND. So I think this is a really long process, a really long time coming in a sense. And the last 30 years could really be seen as sort of the apotheosis of these trends that go back, I think, to the 1930s and 1940s. What's interesting about what you said, I think that's right. And I think that's because there's not a lot of good analysis on the progressive foreign, or really in foreign policy thinking generally, between making an analytical distinction between what I call the foreign policy of the state and the foreign policy of civil society. So a lot of these discussions have focused explicitly on the foreign policy of the state, which is what literal state institutions like the military, the National Security Council, the CIA, and parastate institutions like, I would say, the foreign policy establishment, places like Brookings, CFR, the RAND Corporation, places that essentially act as the research arm of the national security state, what they should do. And I think that's been conflated with the foreign policy of civil society, which is what non-state organizations can and should do. So while I'm very skeptical about what state organizations should do, what the military should do abroad, I would argue that I'm not by any means advocating an isolationist or pseudo-isolationist foreign policy, but maintaining that NGOs and things like that should work towards building transnational solidarities that are related to my own particular politics, which are essentially socialist. So what I would argue is that there should be sort of these transnational socialist coalitions that exist at sub-state levels that are distinguished from the foreign policy of the state, what, for example, a lefty working for the NSC would actually do. And I think it's important to analytically distinguish between those. Now, they're connected, but they're not necessarily the same.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's start with what you think, for lack of a better way of putting it, the foreign policy state should be doing, which it sounds like the answer is, from your perspective, not all that much. I mean, so what are you articulating in terms of what American foreign policy should look like from the state side?
So in terms of the state, I think that it's been proven in the last 25 plus years that we're not able to do nation building. So we certainly shouldn't do nation building. I think there's a moral problem with having this permanent low hum war that Samuel Moyn has written extensively about, sort of the cleaning of permanent war through things like drone strikes. I would also argue that the time has come to reconsider some of the fundamental assumptions of the American empire. So do we really need 800 bases existing all over the world? I would say no. I'd say we should start getting rid of those bases. What I would also advocate for is joining international institutions like the International Criminal Court, the Paris Agreement, things along those lines, and in fact making them even more progressive if that was possible. Building up the political will for that is also connected. So this is also an argument in favor of a particular type of domestic politics as well. I think they're very interconnected. And then I think we need to have discussions where reasonable people could disagree. For example, about the role of NATO. If we're going to draw down NATO, how do we deal with things like European security? But in terms of rising powers and things along those lines, I actually take a rather realist view, even though not every realist disagrees about this, where we shouldn't essentially provoke Putin in Ukraine. We should cede some sort of security territory to a great power like Russia. I also don't think we should be in East Asia forever. We should negotiate some sort of security transition where we're able to, as much as is possible, protect our ally security in the region. I also think we should basically contribute to international disarmament, things like that, a nuclear drawdown, I would even say unilaterally. So basically what you would think a progressive would advocate for on the international stage.
Actually, until that last progressive thing, I was thinking you were describing Barry Posen's strategy. So,
overlap, as Steve Walt argued in the recent foreign policy, I think that right now there's a lot of overlap between lefties like myself, restrainer centrists like Posen, and also some might even say on the libertarian right, although I have to say that the libertarian right, I think, is an effective political force, is not that important necessarily. So I think what we're going to see going forward, and particularly in the next 10, 15 years, is whether restrainers and lefties are able to build some sort of coalitional politics to begin to draw down all of these things that I just talked about.
Okay, so let me, as someone who, I don't consider myself a progressive necessarily, and I certainly don't consider myself a socialist. So let me think about, a couple ways that one would potentially push back.
Not push back.
One obvious thing is that, you can argue that one of the real problems with American grand strategy and foreign policy over the last couple decades, you would argue it's this problem with bipartisanship, but there's a separate problem, which is the degree to which each president coming in articulates a grand strategy that presumably assumes almost decades-long commitment to particular principles, which never lasts through even their own administration, much less the successive administrations. And so, George W. Bush, say what you will about his grand strategy, and I don't think it didn't work. It was coherent, however, but he kept talking about how it would need to have a generations-long commitment, and of course, that doesn't happen. Instead, there's an almost complete reaction to it. I suspect in some ways you're going to see the same thing in response to, the president that winds up succeeding Donald Trump. Indeed, if you take a look at public opinion polling, what is striking to me is the degree to which every aspect of Trump's foreign policy that he emphasizes becomes less and less popular when he talks about it. So, given that what you're proposing is a foreign policy that would, needless to say, no, I won't. I mean, I don't know if I would describe it as mainstream. And so therefore, the question is, even if you could implement it, what would happen, if 4 years later someone just comes back and winds up, implementing the exact opposite of it, I guess. In other words, I guess I'm curious about what you think is the sustainability of what you're proposing.
Well, I think this is why you can't just view it as a total foreign policy discussion. It's totally related to domestic politics. I mean, this project will never succeed without a larger domestic project of political education. So that's why in my New York Times op-ed, one of my major points, one of the 5 points, was threat deflation, which is essentially...
Oh, threat inflation. Okay, yeah.
No, threat deflation.
Oh, deflation, or combating threat inflation. I get that.
Yeah, combating threat inflation, which is essentially a project of political education, right? So it would involve a project of political education, which should occur throughout all levels of society. For example, Dan, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I imagine in your grade school and high school education, you didn't learn much about the American occupation of the Philippines.
That was surprisingly not a large topic of my American history class.
It's a larger. This is why I think it's important to emphasize the political element of it, the socialist element, because it's connected to a much larger project of sort of refiguring and reconceiving how Americans actually understand their own history, their own nation's role in the world. To me, it's a gross project of educational mismanagement that people don't learn in high school. that they're living in the global hegemon that has hundreds and hundreds of bases around the globe and spends more than the next, whatever it is, 7 countries on the military. So to build that sort of large sustainable coalition, it doesn't happen overnight. It's a medium and long-term project on one hand. And related to that, it also involves building an alternative institutional architecture that could challenge the bloc, which is obviously very, very entrenched and has been entrenched and was built over the course of decades. And this isn't going to happen overnight. This is literally a generations-long project because we have a generations-long empire that's been existing for so long. So that's what I say to you. You have to bring in the politics to make this all workable at all. And I think one of my problems with the foreign policy discussion is it's almost and on any foreign policy discussion, all the podcasts, et cetera, and all the writing in foreign policy, it's focused on tomorrow. And to me, it's not a very interesting discussion in a lot of ways, because I think you need to go back to first principles. And even if you look at the 40s and the 50s and sort of, for example, what the Brookings Institution published in the 40s compared to what it publishes now, it publishes this is what the strategy should be for next year. In the 40s, it was presenting much larger visions about what should the United States' role in the world be, not this assumption of American leadership and American hegemony. So I would say we need to change the entire institutional infrastructure in American foreign policy and how we very much approach these questions. Have a more truly historical lens.
So that actually gives rise to a follow-up question, which is, in some ways, I understand your distinction between what you want the foreign policy states to do and what you want civil society to do. And in some ways, the project you're talking about depends, in some ways, far more, I would argue, on civil society than necessarily on who controls the political state. But this gives rise to a couple of questions. So one of the interesting things is that you can argue, and I think this is one of the reasons, frankly, the Trump administration has foundered so much in its foreign policy, is that actually it hasn't been able to draw on that much talent from what we would consider the blob, as it were, because there is no right-wing populist think tank. There's no right-wing, there's no populist nationalist, sort of cadre of thinkers that Trump could tap into to actually run things like the NSC. What?
Because now someone like Gorka gets in, an alternative expert, essentially, right? You're going to the bottom of the barrel.
Right, so, exactly. You're literally you've got D-listers and below D-listers running these things. So as a result, it winds up, looking pretty bad. But one could argue that the same is true, unfortunately true, potentially on the progressive side of things, which is, I can't think necessarily of a, if I think like left think tanks, I guess maybe New America, maybe Brookings is centrist.
No.
Yeah, and I'm sure to you, you're like, wait a minute, why are you talking about those things, far on the right? So yeah. I guess the question is, where do you get the resources to be able to create this kind of infrastructure that you're talking about?
No, I think that's right. And this is, again, it comes back to the problem ultimately of capitalism, right? Billionaires and rich corporations have funded certain types of foreign policy think tanks and have not funded others, right? So it's related to this larger political project that I'm
I was holding this up again because this is pretty much what I was talking about. Sorry, go ahead.
100% right, and this is why I thought that was a great book, and I think it's really important bringing this problem to the attention of the public and the blob itself. No, and I think you're absolutely right, and it's an enormous problem, and that's one of my biggest critiques of the American left and the Chomsky generation of foreign policy criticism. So I wrote I wrote a piece for Dissent criticizing Tom Wright's recent All Measures Short of War, which to me was quite banal and was essentially a summary of the New York Times of the last 2 years. But the major point that I made, criticism of the left, was that anti-imperialism is not a foreign policy. So the left, since the 1960s, has essentially adopted a position of critique without building up the cadre necessary to operate within these institutions. And one of the reasons, as a historian, as a professional historian, that I'm very interested in studying the history of libertarianism, I think they are the most successful radical movements in American history. And they were radical partially because they understood the importance of institutions to American policy very early on. So Cato's founded in 1977, and that is probably one of the best places, I think, today for foreign policy thinking, people like John Glaser and Edmund Ashford. But they understood that institutions are critical, and the left totally abandoned this space to the political center and the political right. So it's a project that should have been being undertaken in the 1960s and the 1970s and was totally not, and you're only starting to get it done now. So again, I think it's going to take years and a generations-long project. You have one think tank, what is the name of it? The Institute for Policy Studies, which was slightly important in the late 1970s, but for a variety of reasons really fell out of favor once Reagan came into power. Right. The entire political spectrum turned pretty much to the right. So yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think what we're just doing now, my generation of basically academics and intellectuals and thinkers, is trying to build these sorts of institutions. People like Matt Brunig, who's doing it on the domestic side, Progressive Policy Project. But the problem is, again, the billionaires are not going to fund socialist political projects that are essentially anti or post-capital in their orientation. So what do? Brunig tries to fund his through Patreon. I think this is the problem with our political system, and the system that's essentially run by money. So you've identified a problem, and this is why you're going to be socialist by the end of the conversation.
I don't think I'm going to be socialist, but I appreciate you trying to convert me. But it does strike me, we're approaching the midterms, obviously. Those are, I think, 10 days away or 11 days away as we're talking. And the reason I bring this up is one of the things that I find striking is that in terms of campaign contributions, I wrote the most socialist article I will ever write, actually, for the Peterson Institute for National Economics, the title of which is called "Why Capital Will Always Swipe Right." That basically arguing that the sort of high net worth individuals and multinational corporations, the kind of billionaires you're talking about, they don't love Trump for a whole variety of reasons. They would prefer that, they like globalization. They don't want the anti-immigrant sentiment and so on and so forth. But my argument is that if they have to choose between them and the populist left, they will go right every day of the week and twice on Sundays, because as much as they don't, what?
Of course, yeah, of course.
Because as much as they don't like those policies, they do like the tax cuts and they do like the deregulation and they do like the corporate-friendly judiciary. Right. Now, one of the pushbacks I've gotten when I wrote that, and I think it's a fair pushback, is that one of the ways that presumably progressives can counteract that kind of money going to the right is through large amounts of small-scale contributions, which is, in fact, correct me if I'm wrong, what you've seen in the midterms. Democrats have done a great job of they've outraised the Republicans across a wide variety of dimensions. Right. But the thing I kept wondering is that, raising money for political campaigns is one thing. Doing a Patreon for a think tank or for a foundation is something entirely different.
No, it's incredibly problematic. And again, like everything in our neoliberal society, it devolves responsibility onto the individual. So again, it's a structural problem, right? The individual shouldn't have to give so much of their salary to just support policies that they want to see supported, right? We've seen the total destruction of any sort of government funding of any of these types of political projects, so that it becomes only billionaires. So again, I think you've identified a particular problem with the neoliberal age. I wish it was different, but I don't see another way out in the short term.
Right. I guess the other way that it does strike. So here's the thing. I understand your side of this, and I understand the other notion of trying to tie traditional progressive values to a foreign policy, the sort of Bernie Sanders approach, for lack of a better way of putting it. It does strike me, however, and you can disabuse me of this again, the fundamental fact about Americans when it comes to foreign policy is that Americans don't care. Americans are fundamentally disaffected when it comes to foreign policy. It's not that they don't like what's going on, or it's not that they like it either. They just are radically uninformed about this for a variety of reasons, most of which have to do with the fact that American foreign policy fundamentally does not affect most Americans.
Well, and it's also an entirely elite project. I mean, consciously since the 1940s. So the question is, if you were actually able to develop mechanisms that got Americans more democratically involved in the management of their global empire, would they be more involved? I don't know. It's an empirical question. Maybe we could only decide. But yeah, I mean, that's the Walter Lippmann argument that that he made in Public Opinion in the Phantom Public, that most people, all they want to do is care about bread and butter issues and not even that much and live their lives. Now, that
was, by the way, literally the only opinion on which Walter Lippmann was constant on throughout his entire career. Go ahead.
Right. This is a very progressive project, right? The progressives wanted experts and bureaucrats, and they wanted to basically remove the public from the policymaking process. That's a value question. I disagree with that as in terms of values. I'm a Democrat, ultimately, fundamentally, more than I'm a socialist, more than I'm anything. I think political sovereignty derives from the people. So what it's up for, it's the responsibility of the elites to try to make the system more democratic, make people have more investment in the system, educate them about the fact that they're involved in this. And one way to do that is to also, again, support distributionist policies, so people aren't just spending their lives working horrible work hours or fighting for the last scrap. So to get them involved in actually the management of their politics.
So you want an elite-driven project that will lead to more democracy.
And the question is, how do you get from A to Z?
Yeah. And I mean, in some ways, that's the question I have both domestically and internationally, because a lot of the international stuff that you and Barry Posen and others talk about in terms of, American retrenchment, it's not necessarily that I think the end state is undesirable or might not necessarily be the right idea. It's always, how do you get from A to Z without it causing actually more instability than you think it's going to?
Well, why? What do you mean by instability? Like international instability? Why is instability?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of in other words, how does an American retrenchment from the Pacific Rim, how does a drastic scaling down of NATO and of U.S. overseas military commitments, not lead to more instability as opposed to less? It's easy to sort of hand wave and say, okay, look what the United States has done over the last 20 years. It's made a hash of everything. Surely, what the hell do you have to lose? And I get very leery of those arguments because, in fact, things can definitely get worse. There are many ways in which, global instability would actually be worse without American leadership than I think than otherwise would be. This doesn't mean that I think everything is hunky-dory now, but I do worry about the transition phase. In other words, I worry about, even this is where what you're proposing is in some ways weirdly rhetorically akin to what Trump is proposing, in the sense of getting your
Brand's argument, and that's totally wrong.
Say that again.
Hal Brands made that argument in Bloomberg, and it was absurd. And it's
let me so just in the sense of you presumably want, like Trump, our Democratic allies to pay more than their fair share to start taking more ownership of their own security, and therefore what?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, okay. That I'm not saying anything more than that. I'm just saying, and by the way, it should be pointed out, Trump was hardly the first president to make that point. Barack Obama made that point, consistently as well. So it's not like that it's unique to Trump. But in some ways, what I'm more interested in is the reaction that has triggered, which I would say is not necessarily all that productive among our Democratic allies. And so, is that I guess my question is that a Trump-specific variable, or you think that if a socialist or a more progressive foreign policy leader makes that argument, it'll go down smoother?
Well, I think again, it's about building these sorts of transnational left-wing solidarities. One, I have much less of a fetish for stability as a good in and of itself. I mean, I think what you've shown is that anything that's stable for long enough is obviously going to be unstable. I mean, things tend toward, especially capitalism tends towards instability, crash after crash. Now the rise of these right-wing populist movements, these nationalist movements in Europe especially. So I'm less concerned about instability in the short term, which will lead not only to stability in the medium and long terms, but justice. A more just global society and more just domestic systems. So I think that I would think the trade-off in instability in the short term might be worth stability in the medium and long terms, and especially. Sorry, yes, go.
No, that's fine. The other thing that I'm struck by listening to you is the degree to which, and you're right. It's one of the things about American foreign policy up till now is that it's largely been a bipartisan affair in terms of what's been, pre-Trump. It's been, there hasn't been much variation from president to president. And this has in some ways allowed, Americans to make the case in terms of grand strategy that the strategy will be sustainable in some ways. That much, beyond the sort of out of bounds notions, like let's say George W. Bush and the sort of 2001 grand strategy, the sort of traditional liberal internationalism always got bipartisan support. But what you're proposing is a decidedly partisan grand strategy, right? In the sense, when you talk about it, it's not just changes in American foreign policy. It's the notion that American civil society is going to network with left and progressive movements elsewhere with the idea of bolstering them as well.
I just want to make one quick point. I think it's important to emphasize that bipartisan consensus, which has always been presented as non-ideological or technocratic, is extremely ideological.
Sure.
And has like a very, I would say, conservative politics underlining it. So what I'm essentially doing is
go with Louis Hartz, but okay.
I'm sorry?
Louis Hartz, but okay.
Okay, but I think I'm just being explicit.
Yeah.
A lot of the politics that already undergird these things, and one of the most annoying things about the Democratic right, people like Hillary Clinton, etc., phrase their ideological commitments as being above politics, which was in fact a strategy adopted very consciously in the construction of the national security state, the American empire and American hegemony in the 1940s, which was presenting a very political position as in fact being above politics. So I think it's important just to emphasize that historical point.
I guess that might answer the question. I suppose one of the things that I've been disturbed by over the last couple of years is the degree to which, the kind of degree of political polarization we're seeing domestically is actually now playing itself out in terms of foreign policy, literally in terms of like who our allies and who they're not, to the point where, Trump in power, I think you could argue, see Saudi Arabia and Israel as stronger allies than, let's say, Western Europe or Japan or what have you. Whereas when Democrats are in power, when the left is in power, it's continental Europe and other actors. I guess my question is, as someone who is part of that blob, I kind of like the stability. I like the fact that there isn't necessarily that much in the way of vicissitudes of foreign policy going forward. What you're proposing will generate its own counter reaction, though. I mean, it's not going to be this case of, conservatives just going gently into that good night. And so I guess what I wonder is the degree to which...
I think it's important to emphasize that it's generational. People have different generational experiences. So millennials, their primary political experiences was not the end of the Cold War, was not the 1990s. It's Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, Syria, Libya, and the financial crisis.
Yes.
So it also has to do with the fact that the baby boomers are very much remain in power. I wrote an op-ed on gerontocracy for The Guardian. You saw it in the Kavanaugh hearings. And once the baby boomers see power, or sad to say, literally start dying, I think you're going to see a rather quick political shift. So it's also important, I think, to have a historical lens about things that appear indefinite and forever, I think, are actually going to change. Also because the millennial cohort is so large and so much larger than Generation X. And Generation X also is the quote-unquote lost generation, particularly on the left, because the Democratic establishment totally passed them over. So I think you're actually going to see a lot of these politics change rather swiftly and rather quickly, and you're in fact seeing it now. People my age, I just turned 34 a couple of weeks ago, as we come onto the stage, things are going to change relatively quickly, and I don't think this is going to be a phenomenon limited to the United States, but to Western Europe as well. So I think it's also to take into account that things are going to naturally change and history naturally moves on, and a lot of these assumptions are going to, I think, change rather quickly.
So 2 quick reactions. First, as Generation X, I'm just embittered by this entire conversation, obviously, because once again, political power is going to skip right over us from the baby boomers to the millennials. We're just going to be, making sardonic comments on the sidelines. But the second and more serious question. So one other pushback. I mean, what do you think about the argument made by, let's say, Yascha Mounk and others that, there's this concern that, and I can already see from your reaction, I'm going to enjoy this, that the generations that you're talking about, they're going to rise up, actually have very anti-democratic or at best wan attitudes about democracy.
Well, one thing I think it's important to notice about people like Mounk and a lot of the sort of democratic skeptics, people like Tim Snyder, Sarah Kendzior, even to some degree Masha Gessen, they're all specialists in Europe, and they're particularly all having a specialist in Eastern Europe. So I think their purview is decided by that lens of sort of Central Eastern Europe post-Cold War politics. And I think if you look at actually what millennials mostly think, the alt-right and the conservatives are actually, the far right are actually a much, much smaller part of the cohort than the media, the largely boomer-controlled media makes it seem. So I think if you actually look at the numbers, millennials are actually quite progressive on a lot of issues. And I actually feel a bit bad for Mock, because to me, he made he made the choice to align with a certain liberal Democrat constituency, which I don't think is going to be long for this world in the next 10, 15 years. And I think it's going to look like a very historically specific thing that happened in the aftermath of Trump. And this is why, for example, in a lot of my public writing, I'm very skeptical of the Weimar analogy, which is people like Tim Snyder, his book on lessons from the 20th century, and Mock in his book on fascism, and Madeleine Albright in her book on fascism, et cetera, et cetera. They constantly invoke the Weimar analogy. And I think that's a total misunderstanding of American history. And I think it's also a misunderstanding of the fact that that analogy was invoked to essentially create extremely anti-democratic institutions like the national security state in the 1940s and 1950s, and has been continuously invoked ever since. So I think they're just wrong. I think they're imposing a lens from Europe onto the United States that isn't accurate, and also a lens from a particular moment in European history that doesn't actually represent what's going on in the United States now.
So wait, paradoxically, isn't that exactly what Hans Speyer did?
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. It's a metaphor and analogy is actually really important to foreign policy thinking, and it's something that I like invoking in my own and examining my own work. And if you actually think about it, it's quite strange that probably the two most important analogies of post-1945 American history, Munich and the collapse of Weimar democracy, are both not things that which the United States actually had no say or really any impact. So it's important how we could see how the Europeanization to some degree of some of our fundamental foreign policy metaphors, I think, have actually distorted the theory and practice of American foreign policy since the 40s.
Well, okay, so one last thing on this, because in some ways this gets to the heart of it. I think you're overlooking one analogy that was very popular post-1945, which was Smoot-Hawley, which was a U.S.-born, case and sort of highlighted For what?
The tariffs.
Right, yeah, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in 1930.
Yeah, well, America, that's a much more, the American tradition of free trade and laissez-faire is much deeper than American democratic skepticism, I think. I think that has a true history.
Whoa. This is where historically I'm going to push back on you. The American history of free trade is actually much shallower, I would argue, than is commonly understood.
I mean, this is Daniel Rogers sort of writing about the 19th and early 20th century when he sees the sort of bringing in of British laissez-faire attitudes into the elite of the American economics profession and the foreign policy establishment, which were the ones who matter here. Maybe you're right, popular, but I'm talking about sort of the bureaucrats and analysts and experts.
I'm not just thinking popular, I'm also thinking in terms of trade policy, in which the U.S. was ridiculously protectionist for a long period of time. Briefly, I think you can argue at the very turn of the century, lowered tariffs somewhat, and then really was responsible for a lot of the instability in the interwar period, precisely because in 1920 it raises tariffs, through the emergency farm tariff, and then passes a whole series of tariffs, Fordney-McCumber, and then Smoot-Hawley. The reason I bring all this up is that that's one of the things that presumably animated the notion that after the end of World War II, one of the stabilizing forces that was thought to be, for the world going forward was the idea of a liberal international economic order.
Well, I would say what did you say, and tell me if you think I'm wrong here, but there are also people like John Hay, who very early on is advocating in favor of an open door laissez-faire trade policy, at least it relates to the United States and East Asia. So I would say that there are two trends that rise and fall at various moments in where you actually look in the government.
Fair enough. Although the Hay, let me put it this way: I would describe the Hay note as the open door policy as an exception rather than a rule, in terms of or rather.
What about the conquest of the Philippines and the conquest of sort of the insular empire? That was all about providing access to markets. Yeah. So it depends where you look. I would say it depends where you look.
No, that's fair.
Talking about the North Atlantic, I think you're right. When you're talking about the global South, I think it's less right, is how I put it.
But I guess my question is that in terms of, and this is something where Nexon in particular in his article, generally I don't know if he wouldn't like the word neoliberal, but he's generally more enthusiastic about the idea of trade openness. I'm trying to recall if you said anything about this in your Times piece, but I'm basically sort of curious, what's the foreign economic policy component of what you're proposing?
I did talk about it a little bit. It would basically try to reorganize the hierarchies that exist presently between the global North and the global South. So it would be, again, based on foreign policies of civil society and economic justice. So it would involve, to take a practical issue, it would involve having a less hierarchical relationship with Mexico vis-a-vis the United States, where it doesn't just serve as a font of American exports and labor coming into the United States, but actually has programs of justice and redistribution, again, a socialist policy. So you try to break down the hierarchical order that presently exists, and I would argue actually leads to much human misery in the short, medium, and long terms. And I like free trade in the broad idea. I think people should be exchanging goods across boundaries, but the horrible hierarchical economic order we have where the global North totally dominates the global South and has for the entire history of colonialism, I would say is very problematic from a political values perspective.
I guess I'm wondering whether the political moment is ripe for that right now, because while you might be correct in terms of talking about the degree in which the North has benefited, the global North has benefited from globalization, that hasn't necessarily been true, particularly in the post-2008 world, where, in fact, it's actually the global South that has been generating a fair amount of global economic growth, whereas you actually have stagnation in the North. And this has led to a lot of widespread perceived resentment against countries like China, and Mexico and so on and so forth, is somehow stealing American jobs and so on and so forth. Now, as you would say that maybe that's all, happening through a neoliberal paradigm or what have you, but it's nonetheless one that people are familiar with, whereas what you're proposing to introduce is something that's going to require genuinely radical thinking, not just on the part of elites, but actually on the part of the masses, for lack of a better way of putting it.
This is why political education is so critical, and this is why I think your book was so right. We don't need thought leaders, we need actual intellectuals. What do intellectuals do? They examine the existing system and try to think outside of it. And I think this is what we on the progressive left should be doing, essentially. We should be, but from a positive perspective, proposing specific policies to get us from A to Z, not just critiquing it, not just being like capital blah, blah, blah. But how do we actually work within the existing system? Because I'm not a revolutionary. I don't think revolutions work. I think history has demonstrated they always devolve into horribleness. So I'm not a revolutionary. I'm not a vanguardist. I'm a Democrat. fundamentally. So the question is, again, this is probably a generations-long project and is related to political education. Now, also, I think there's actually, the time is right for that, because who's actually mostly benefited? Sure, more people have been brought out of poverty, but that's mostly limited to China. And really, you have the creation, again, Marx is a genius, he predicted this early on, of a bourgeois global elite. That's what's really been created. So as Americans have gone down, the global South has gone like slightly up, but most people have, but that those gains have been mostly limited to a particular cohort of these particular countries who meet in Davos and various areas, etc. MBS gets to hang out with Warren Buffett at Davos. That may be great, but I think that's a representative of a fundamentally corrupt political economic system. And what we as intellectuals should do, I think, should basically, I mean, we have to be guided by our own values. Maybe some people want to have this vanguardist, type or elite system. I don't. I want to have a more democratic and redistributive system. So that's what I would say to that.
Fair enough. I'm trying to think if there's anything. Do you want to talk about your book some, or?
Yeah. I mean, basically, just to be.
Give me the elevator pitch.
Yeah, the elevator pitch of the book is I essentially examine the origins of the bipartisan consensus and how it came to be that all of these institutions were created in the late 1940s, these consciously anti-democratic institutions, I argue, which is to design a foreign policy that won't be informed by the public. And what I argue essentially is that the experience with Nazism in particular was very critical to leading a generation of foreign policy experts in the 1940s to create a particular set of institutions that consciously took foreign policy. Well, it was never really in the hands of the people, but made sure that it wouldn't be in the hands of the people when you're fighting the emergency of the Cold War. So what essentially happens is that people, foreign policy experts, analogize the Soviets with the Nazis starting in the 1930s, and once the Soviets get the bomb in the 1940s, they diagnose an existential crisis that is similar to the one that they had identified in the 1930s and create institutions that are designed to manage this permanent crisis, which they themselves understood to be anti-democratic. But what's interesting is that in the 1930s, they argued that once these crises were over, you no longer would need to adopt anti-democratic methods that totally remove the public from foreign policy making. But I think when you institutionalize this ideology, it has a logic on its own, which is why when the Cold War ended, a lot of these institutions just continue to exist, and you have what I call Cold War on steroids, or Cold War plus. So,
I guess one of the thoughts I have on this is that, and I can anticipate what your response is, but what would you say to the notion that inherently foreign policy is an elite-run enterprise? Now, you're right that the institution. Hold on. The institutions that were set up obviously in some ways endow that. But the reason I say that is that even if you could somehow democratize it somewhat, I am dubious of the notion that Americans care all that much about it. And this goes again to this question of public interest, which is to say that it's one thing to say that you want foreign policy to be more democratic, to have more participation, but in some ways it almost requires forced participation. And I'm not sure, as someone who rebelled against having to attend, Hebrew school, God knows how long, because of forced participation, I get very leery about the notion of any kind of foreign policy machinery being run like my Sunday school.
No, of course, you should never have forced participation. I mean, I think we're all adherents to liberal values. You don't want people you don't want the state to force someone to participate.
But I guess my question is, without forced participation, how do you have a public that is informed enough to actually participate in the way you want them to on questions of foreign policy?
Well, I would say we're particularly alienated as a society right now, and I would say that's a function of capitalism. I mean, when you create these hyper-alienated societies organized around units like the nuclear, you see it in parenting, right? Where like elite bourgeois parenting is obsessive. It's all about the helicopter parenting because there's not a community to raise this child that's existed for 99.9% of human history. So we're all incredibly alienated, and it's not surprising that when we're all incredibly alienated, we don't care about larger political questions. But you have to start thinking about these issues in cultural and social terms, where you start building bonds between people, and you're not forcing them apart which is what the capitalist economy tends to do. So again, it's not just related to foreign policy, it's related to this whole larger politics of de-alienization. De-alienating a society which is incredibly, incredibly alienated. We all live in our little boxes. We're all disconnected from each other. We're all quote unquote bowling alone. To me, that's not a recipe for a happy human existence at all. So we also need to rethink fundamental human structures, going back to things like the nuclear family, which is a very modern invention, which seems so natural to us. but is very, very much a 20th century invention. So again, we have to do radical rethinking, because you might disagree, but I don't think we're doing all that well right now. I don't think people in the world are particularly happy, and I don't think we've particularly contributed to human flourishing in any meaningful way.
I'm going to suggest two things. First, I'm pretty sure the happiness studies suggest that, in fact, actually there has been a significant increase in happiness. Has there been?
I have an epistemological issue with things like happiness studies.
Okay, fair enough. The second is, and more importantly, I don't want to live with my parents. And so, that would definitely not cause happiness. I got along much better with my parents the moment I got out of the house. I suspect that, actually, come to think of it, my son, who is now a freshman in college, I think feels the same way.
But that's not what I'm not saying living in the...
No, I understand. That was more satirical.
Okay, so you know what I'm saying. It's about these larger, how we live in the world. What seems so natural to us is actually historical.
Okay, I guess my one problem with this is that when I'm hearing you say this stuff, it is making me flash back to the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2016, where whenever he was asked on a sort of tough question, his answer was always, well, once we get we need the socialist revolution to be able to implement the policies that I want, which struck me as a little bit of hand waving. Now, I think you've got a better answer, which is you're saying this is a generations long project, but I'm not sure a generations long project really satisfies, what we need to do in the next, let's say, 2.5 years or so forth.
Yeah, but where we are now is a generations long project too.
Say it again.
Where we got now, the sort of neoliberal hegemony we live in now, is also a generations-long project, right? I think I think you're right. I think the left needs to have short-term answers, it needs to have medium-term answers, and it needs to have long-term answers. And my big critique of the left of the 1960s is they only had the latter two. They had no project of positive governance working within the system we have now. So I think you're right. I think Bernie can't just hand-wave that, or any socialist politician can't just hand-wave that. They actually have to have a positive issue, but I also think it's important to keep in mind this larger political project of which it is a part.
This also reminds me, I don't know if you had a chance to look at this, but I assume that, if nothing else, congratulations. You as a socialist have now caught on the radar of the U.S. Council of Economic Advisors in the White House. Have you heard about this report that they issued this week?
Of course. I did hear about it.
I did love the sentence where they cite Lenin, they cite Mao, and then they immediately go to Sanders and Warren, because that's a seamless transition right then and there.
Right, but this is how the global left was presented throughout the Cold War, very consciously, right? That the natural end of Marxist political thought was Mao and Stalin. Now, that's one end, absolutely, and I don't think you could deny that, and I don't think any leftist should deny that. Authoritarianism is bad. This is, again, why I'm a Democrat. If this is not democratically supported, or if anything is not democratically supported, it ultimately leads into liberal technocracy, which is what we have now and what we had in the EU, which is why Brexit happens, or it leads into authoritarian vanguardism, which is also horrible. So again, yeah, I agree, but you could see how these people who wrote that report clearly have a particular historical narrative of what the left is, which I would say is actually inaccurate. It's actually an emancipatory project, and not one that stifles human flourishing, and it's ideal in what we should be working toward.
So I guess the last question I suppose I would ask is that, weirdly enough, do you find things like that report oddly optimistic for you, which is to some ways in sense of, hey, they're noticing you?
It's not really surprising. I feel like people who really came of age in the 1990s and the end of history really had this dismissal of left-wing political thought. But it's just ahistorical. This has been one of the major strands of political thought for the entirety of modernity. So it's not surprising that in the collapse of the Soviet Union, in an American triumphalist context, which now looks incredibly naive and quite silly, that socialism and these ideas were totally shunted to the side. But if you take even a slightly longer-term historical perspective, it's not all that surprising. And it's not all that surprising that millennials identify as much more left-wing because, again, their primary experience with capitalism is 2008, which shows a total collapse of a system that seems to be, at in some level, fundamentally unjust.
I think that's a good place to end.
Yes, thank you so much, Dan. I really appreciate your taking the time out of your no doubt busy schedule to have this wacky conversation with me. No
problem. And as I said, if nothing else, it is genuinely, even though I don't necessarily agree with all of it, it is nice to see not just critiques coming from the left in terms of foreign policy, but rather, as you point out, and I completely agree with you, the idea of creating positive agendas, because in some ways that is the debate that's going to be going on for the next 2 to 6 years, depending upon what happens over the next couple. So I wish you the best of luck in your contributions to that marketplace of ideas.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that.
All right. Take care.
Take care. Bye.